Imagine a cop, driven by prejudice, targeting a frail black woman in the dead of night. His authority feels unshakable, until she calmly reveals an FBI badge. How does a single reckless act spiral into the undoing of a once powerful officer? And what happens when the tables turn, placing all the power in the hands of the very person he tried to intimidate? The truth, devastating and inescapable, is about to unravel everything. Officer Ronald Green sat slumped in his patrol car, fingers tapping idly against the steering wheel. The late-night shift in downtown Richmond, Virginia, always stretched endlessly, each hour heavier than the last. Tonight was no different. The streets were deserted, illuminated only by the flicker of dim streetlights casting long shadows over cracked pavement. His rearview mirror framed the old liquor store, boarded up and lifeless, a ghost of its former self. Nothing stirred. No commotion, no excitement. Just the hollow monotony of another shift in a neighborhood he had written off long ago. His gaze flicked to the dashboard clock. 2:14 a.m. 2 hours to go. He groaned, running a hand through his short, dark hair. The silence was unbearable. Richmond's south side in his eyes was a wasteland. Decaying homes lined the streets, their sagging roofs a testament to years of neglect. The people, to Ronald, they were just as broken, resigned to lives that lacked ambition or hope. They just didn't care, he thought bitterly. But something was about to disturb his night's bleak rhythm. A movement caught his eye, a shadow along the sidewalk. A woman, her silhouette fragile and hunched, shuffled forward. One hand clutched a plastic bag, the other a cane. Her oversized coat swayed as she moved, her brimmed hat obscuring her face. She didn't belong here, not at this hour. Ronald narrowed his eyes, suspicion curling in his gut. What's she doing out here? He muttered under his breath, curiosity sharpening his gaze. She didn't look like trouble, but years on the force had taught him appearances could deceive. His instincts whispered of something out of place, something wrong. Driving slowly past her, he studied her deliberate steps. She wasn't in a rush, nor did she seem to have a purpose. Just waiting, standing there like she was expecting something. Or someone. Ronald frowned, his unease mounting. He pulled his squad car to the curb, the engine humming softly as he kept her in his sights. Unbuckling his seatbelt, he felt it again, the intoxicating rush of authority. The badge, the uniform, it all filled him with a sense of power that dulled the night's tedium. Moments like these were his fuel. Without hesitation, he stepped out of the car, the thud of his boots breaking the stillness. She didn't flinch. She didn't even turn. Her calmness wasn't just unsettling. It was infuriating. People in this neighborhood knew better. They avoided confrontation, kept their heads down. Yet she stood there, unmoving. "Hey!" Ronald's voice echoed, slicing through the quiet. The woman stopped but didn't turn, her back still to him. His steps were deliberate, his posture rigid, every inch of him exuding authority. "It's late," he barked, his tone sharp and clipped. "What are you doing out here?" Finally she turned, her face emerging from beneath the brim of her hat. Wrinkled skin, tired eyes, frail hands that trembled ever so slightly. Her expression was serene, unbothered. "Just heading home, officer," she said softly, her voice steady. He didn't believe her. At this hour? In this place? His eyes flicked to the bag she held. "What's in the bag?" She lifted it slightly. "Groceries." He scoffed, frustration creeping into his tone. It wasn't enough. He demanded to see inside. Slowly, she opened it, a loaf of bread, milk, canned soup. Innocuous, ordinary. But it wasn't enough to quell his suspicions. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, stepping closer. She complied without protest, handing over a worn wallet. Helen Brooks. Local address. Nothing unusual. But her calmness, her refusal to cower, only stoked his anger. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "Do you know what happens around here at night?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I've seen worse things than you could imagine, officer," she replied evenly. The words hit him like a slap. They carried a quiet strength, a weight that unsettled him. His frustration boiled over. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "Let go of me," she said firmly, her calm demeanor unbroken. But he didn't. Rage clouded his judgment, and before he knew it, his fist connected with her face. She stumbled, groceries spilling onto the pavement, but she didn't cry out. Wiping the blood from her lip, she straightened, her movements deliberate and composed. "You're going to regret that," she said softly, her voice laced with quiet certainty. Before he could react, she reached into her coat. His hand instinctively flew to his holster. But what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. A leather badge case snapped open, the gold FBI emblem gleaming under the streetlight. "I'm Special Agent Helen Brooks," she said, her voice calm yet authoritative. And in that moment, everything Ronald thought he knew shattered. Agent Helen Brooks stood firm, her voice calm yet cutting, each word a sharp blade. "You've just made a very big mistake." The world tilted on its axis for Ronald Green, as the gravity of her words settled in his chest. His heart slammed against his ribs, breath catching in shallow, ragged gasps. A mistake? No, this wasn't just any mistake. He had assaulted an undercover FBI agent. Panic exploded inside him, a wild storm of dread unlike anything he'd ever faced. In a career built on command and authority, he now stood stripped of it all, frozen like prey caught in a predator's gaze. How had this happened? How could he have missed the signs? The badge gleamed in her hand like a weapon, her steady demeanor only magnifying his spiraling fear. Every ounce of confidence he'd had moments before was suffocating under the weight of his actions. Helen's unwavering eyes locked onto his, holding him captive in the silence that followed. She didn't have to say more. Her presence spoke volumes, a thick fog of judgment and inevitability wrapping around him. Summoning his shattered composure, Ronald took a step back, the move feeble and unconvincing even to himself. His mind raced. Could he spin this as a misunderstanding? A regrettable accident? But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no salvaging this. "Look," he stammered, his voice quivering. "I didn't know." "You didn't?" "Didn't what?" Helen interjected, her tone as sharp as shattered glass. "Didn't act like someone who deserves respect." Her words sliced through him, their precision leaving no room for rebuttal. He flinched, his attempt to respond dissolving into silence. She was right. He had judged her the instant he saw her, made assumptions, let his own prejudices guide his hand. And now the cost of that snap judgment loomed before him like an abyss. Helen took a measured step forward, her presence towering despite her smaller frame. The power dynamics had flipped entirely. "You made your assumptions the moment you saw me," she said, her voice calm yet blistering. "An older black woman alone at night. And you thought you could treat me however you wanted. But you didn't stop to think. Because people like you never do." Her words struck with the force of a hammer. Ronald felt his defenses crumble under their weight. What could he say? Apologies felt hollow, explanations meaningless. She was right, he hadn't thought. And now, the price of his thoughtlessness was becoming clearer with every second. As the distant wail of sirens broke through the night, Ronald's heart slammed against his chest. The sound wasn't coming for him, though he wished it were. No, they were coming for her, Special Agent Helen Brooks. And with them, they carried his reckoning. Unflinching, Helen waved off the officers who arrived moments later, their weapons lowered at her silent command. She turned to face them, her voice steady and authoritative. "I'm fine," she said simply, "but Officer Green here has some explaining to do." Her words sealed his fate. Ronald felt the ground beneath him collapse. Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed as he approached, his expression a mix of confusion and growing anger. "Special Agent Brooks," he said hesitantly, "what happened here?" Helen didn't so much as glance at him. Her gaze remained locked on Ronald, her words measured and deliberate. "Officer Green assaulted me while I was conducting an undercover operation. I'll need to file an official report." The word assault hit Ronald like a punch to the gut. He tried to respond, but no words came. His silence spoke louder than any excuse he might have mustered. "Turn around," Miller barked, his tone ice cold. Ronald hesitated, his body unwilling to move. But the reality was undeniable. Slowly he turned, the clinking of handcuffs marking the end of the life he had known. As the squad car door slammed shut behind him, he looked back one last time. Helen stood there, calm and unyielding, her expression unreadable. He wanted to plead, to explain, but the moment had passed. In that instant Ronald knew. His career, his identity, his very sense of self. Everything had unraveled with a single reckless act. The weight of his choices pressed down like chains, inescapable and unrelenting. The decision loomed over him, unraveling his world with relentless force. The door creaked open once more, and Sergeant Miller stepped in, his expression as rigid as stone. "You're going to be processed now," Miller announced, his voice devoid of warmth. The words hit Ronald like a sledgehammer. He rose slowly, his legs trembling beneath him, as if they could collapse under the weight of what was to come. Silently, he followed Miller down the corridor, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief. Was this really happening? Could this be his reality now? As they moved through the precinct's hallways, Ronald felt the sharp sting of avoidance. Officers who had once exchanged jokes and shared camaraderie with him now turned their faces away. Their silence screamed louder than words, branding him as an outsider, a pariah among the very people who had once called him one of their own. They entered the processing room, a sterile and unfeeling space that felt like a courtroom and a gallows all at once. Ronald was handed a stack of forms, cold and bureaucratic, informing him of his suspension and the legal storm ahead. Signing his name on the dotted line was like carving his identity into a gravestone. Every letter of his signature seemed to say, "This is the end of who you were." Then came the moment he dreaded most. "You'll need to hand over your badge and your gun," Miller said, his tone flat, as though reciting a line he had practiced 100 times. Ronald hesitated. The badge, the symbol of his authority, his identity, suddenly felt unbearably heavy. With trembling fingers, he unclipped it, the weight in his hand now a cruel reminder of all he had lost. Placing it next to his service weapon on the table felt like tearing away a piece of his soul. "You're free to go for now," Miller added, gesturing toward the door. "But don't get too comfortable. You'll be hearing from the department soon." Each step toward the exit felt like wading through quicksand. The hallways, once buzzing with purpose and familiarity, now seemed alien and hostile. He kept his head down, trying to block out the whispers, the sidelong glances. Outside, the night air struck his face like an icy slap, waking him to the full gravity of his downfall. Hours ago, he had walked these streets with authority, confident in his role as a protector of order. Now the city looked utterly foreign. The lights seemed harsher, the streets colder, the faces of passers-by unknowable. Everything had changed. Helen Brooks. Her name whispered through his thoughts, unshakable. He saw her face again, calm, resolute, even after the confrontation. Her words echoed like a haunting refrain. "This isn't about me. It's about you." Those words gnawed at his conscience, forcing him to confront the harsh truths he had long buried. He had seen her not as a person, but as a challenge to his authority, a threat. And his reaction, a volatile eruption of prejudices he hadn't even known he carried. The realization burned through him. She had been right. He had failed, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. Aimlessly, he wandered the streets, each step burdened by the weight of his shame. Going home wasn't an option. The thought of sitting alone in his apartment, facing his thoughts, was unbearable. He needed an escape. Eventually, a flickering neon sign drew him in. A small bar, tucked away from the bustling streets. He hesitated at the door, then pushed it open, stepping into the dimly lit room. The quiet hum of conversation and clinking glasses offered a fragile refuge. Sinking onto a stool at the counter, he ordered a drink and downed it in a single gulp. But the alcohol did nothing to drown the guilt that gnawed at him. Drink after drink, the same voice persisted, relentless. "You crossed a line. You can't go back." He could see the headlines already. Officer charged with assaulting FBI agent. The media would rip him apart. His career, his reputation, his future, all in ruins. Hours blurred into a haze of regret and self-loathing. Each sip only deepened the chasm of despair. What now? The investigation, the trial, the fallout. They loomed over him, inevitable and unforgiving. As he stumbled out into the cold night once more, one thought clawed its way to the surface. This is just the beginning.